He was involved in assaulting people, trafficking, robberies, and much more. He was more untouchable than ever before. He could do pretty much anything he wanted and get away with it. If he had the slightest inkling of someone being an informant, Casso would either personally kill them or order a hit on them. Anthony Gaspipe Casso was the Lucchese family underboss in the 1980s and killed dozens of people before becoming a government informant. Not a very glamorous way to go out, is it? Gaspipe was one of the most terrifying figures in the mob, and throughout his life, he terrorized pretty much everyone around him. He didn't care about the sacred mafia codes and even killed civilians if he suspected they were informants. The mobster hated informants so much that in 1993, he admitted to killing at least 36 people he suspected of being rats and ordering the execution of 100 more. So it's really no surprise that people rarely testified against him. But first, let's go back to where it all began. Here's the story of the Psychotic Mafia boss people were scared to talk about. So back in the 80s, Anthony Casso was one of the most ruthless mafia bosses in New York City. But this rise in the ranks came with increased paranoia. Casso was Brooklyn through and through. He was born there on May 21st, 1942, and grew up on Union Street near the borough's waterfront, and the signs of his eventual path were always there. He'd often shoot birds off tenement buildings and brownstones with a silenced .22 caliber rifle. He would also often get into teenage scraps with his South Brooklyn boys gang. Mafia culture basically shaped who he was. His godfather, Salvatore Salembrano, used to be the captain of the Genovese crime family and maintained a powerful influence on the Brooklyn docks. Even his father had a record of burglaries in the 40s, but at the same time, he also worked at the docks down at the shore and advised his son to stay out of that life. But this advice fell on deaf ears. Young Anthony was very impressionable, and he admired his father's past way more. So much that he even nicknamed himself Gaspipe after his father's rumored favorite weapon. And that was just the beginning of his journey with the mafia. At the age of 21, he was recruited by the Lucchese crime family. At the same time, he was in the third largest mafia group in the whole city, behind only the Gambino and the Genovese families. At first, he was a loan shark and a bookkeeping enforcer for Christopher Bernardi at the Brooklyn docks, and he seized this opportunity with both hands. He was very good at his job, and Chris immediately took a liking to him, and he possessed a remarkably dark sense of humor, if you can call it that. When one of the dock workers mentioned having new steel shoes, Casso reportedly took over a forklift and dropped over 500 pounds of cargo on the poor dude's feet, breaking most of his toes. Following the incident, he showed no remorse. Instead, he just laughed and said that he wanted to see how good those new boots were.
He was such a f*** up, it was unbelievable.
From the 60s to the mid-70s, he was arrested more or less than 5 times on state and federal charges. He was involved in assaulting people, trafficking, robberies, and much more. But all these cases ended in dismissals because witnesses were just too terrified to testify against him. He impressed all the people working with him and slowly rose in the ranks. In 1977, he and a fellow Lucchese mobster, Vittorio Amuso, were caught up in a massive heroin bust involving a pipeline from Thailand to the United States. And just 2 years later, they both became made men, meaning they were officially in the mafia ranks. It was the beginning of a new and terrifying era. Together, Casso and Vittorio committed a lot of felonies, including extorting contractors and truck companies, substance trafficking, and organizing gambling rackets. They teamed up with members of Bernardi's 19th hole crew to form a burglary ring known as the Bypass Gang. They would regularly break into banks and jewelry stores in Manhattan and Long Island, and by the end of the 80s, they had stolen around 100 million US dollars. By the 80s, Casso had quite the reputation. If the mob needed someone to carry out a difficult job, he was their guy. He had status, connections, and all the brutality and ruthlessness you need from a hitman.
He did so many things, it was ridiculous.
In December 1985, New York's 5 families were going through a period of turmoil. The famous John Gotti of the Gambino family organized a coup against boss Paul Castellano and killed him without approval from the commission, which was in place to regulate such acts. The bosses of the Lucchese and Genovese families were absolutely furious. They wanted revenge, and as you can probably guess, they hired Anthony Casso for the job. And he and his partner, Amuso, started looking for an opening. Gambino capo, Daniel Marino, was their inside man, and he told them about a meeting Gotti was going to attend at the Veterans and Friends Club in Brooklyn on April 13th, 1986. Smartly, they didn't get their hands dirty themselves. Instead, they paid members of an unaffiliated gang to plant explosives on Frank DeCicco's Buick Electra. Frank and Gotti's underboss, and so the plan was set in motion. But then, Gotti canceled his attendance at the very last minute, a decision that saved his life. As a result, only DeCicco was murdered. This attempted bombing kind of backfired against Casso. The Gambino family knew that their boss was being attacked, and they started looking for the people who were responsible. Many people were sent to kill Gaspipe, but he always managed to survive and come out on top. In November 1986, the boss of the Lucchese family, Anthony Corallo, was convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 100 years in prison. He made Amuso the new head, and this change in the leadership changed everything. No one could have known what was about to happen. At this point, Casso was appointed as consigliere. Yes, like Silvio Dante in The Sopranos. He was more untouchable than ever before. He could do pretty much anything he wanted and get away with it. If he had the slightest inkling of someone being an informant, Casso would either personally kill them or order a hit on them. Really, the best option for everyone was to just act in his interest. To stay informed, they even bought a couple of NYPD officers named Stephen Caracappa and Luis Eppolito. Eppolito even had a small role in the Martin Scorsese's classic 1992 movie, Goodfellas. He paid them a salary of $4,000 a month, and in return, they would tip him off about snitches or any coming indictments. And that's not all. The 2 cops would go on to murder a total of 8 people for the mobster. But smartly, he didn't communicate with them directly. An associate of his, Burton Kaplan, was the middleman between himself and the so-called mafia cops, and these contacts were put to good use in September 1986. Casso was the target of an attempted mob hit, and the 2 officers had the chance to earn their pay. They found one of the hitmen, James Heidel, and abducted him. When they brought him to Casso, the mobster brutally tortured him while trying to find out who had ordered the hit. When he was finally satisfied with the answer, he shot Heidel up to 15 times and put him out of his misery.
That's the hatred I had for him. I wanted to beat him with the gun after it was empty. He just tried to kill me. He doesn't deserve anything. That's the law anyway.
As Casso was spreading terror in New York, the FBI was surveilling him. He was spending an insane amount of money on suits, hotel rooms, and restaurant bills, and they were waiting for him to slip. In 1990, Casso was made underboss. He was killing suspected informants everywhere, from Harlem to the Bronx, and even in New Jersey. By the start of the 90s, he had murdered at least 17 individuals. He was a man of expensive taste and started building a $1 million mansion in the Mill Basin area of Brooklyn. But while he was enjoying his time at the top, bodies kept turning up in the garages of car trunks or disappearing altogether. Murder became Amuso and Casso's calling card. It didn't even matter if someone was an outsider, a rival, or even a part of their own family. If someone rubbed them the wrong way, even slightly, they would straight up murder them. No one was off limits. The family's New Jersey faction once refused to send over 50% of the earnings to the power in New York. As a response, Amuso and Casso ordered the entire crew to be wiped out. While it didn't come to that in the end, the tone was set. You didn't play around with these guys. But then, things started to go wrong. In May 1990, his NYPD sources told him about a racketeering indictment by the federal court. Both Casso and Amuso realized that they might have to go to prison, and they decided to make a run for it. While Amuso was arrested a year later in Pennsylvania, Casso remained hidden. He made Alfonso Darco the acting boss, but everyone knew that he was running things from the shadows.
Bodies were falling all around him.
He would continue to order mob hits over the next 2 years, and at one point, he even got his architect killed for complaining about late payments for his $1 million mansion. And in November 1990, the two crooked cops were at it again. At Casso's orders, they murdered a Gambino family capo, Edward Lino. Casso suspected that Lino was involved in the hit attempt on his life, and for this piece of extra work, he gave Eppolito and Caracappa $65,000 US. On another occasion, he ordered a hit on Peter Chiodo, a fellow mafioso suspected of being an informant. He was shot 12 times at a gas station, but survived the attack. Casso sent out a direct threat that if Fat Pete testifies against him, the mobster would murder his wife. Miraculously enough, Chiodo was one of the very few who survived Anthony Casso's wrath, and that was unheard of. Finally, Alfonso Darco took note of all the carnage around him and realized that Casso wasn't just targeting informants. He was executing individuals without remorse, and often for no reason, which made him more terrifying than ever before. Darco feared for his life of his children and decided to contact the FBI. He became a government witness and gave them a lot of super valuable information. Casso was more out of control than ever before. In 1992 and 1993, respectively, he tried to do the unthinkable by ordering hits on a federal prosecutor and a judge. The director of the crime task force said that all of the most powerful families weren't well organized, and that instability allowed individuals like Casso to rise up. One investigator who had covered his cases once described him as a ruthless homicidal maniac who enjoyed killing, and it sure seems that way. Casso said that being a mafia boss was like being a movie star.
It's better than being a Hollywood star. No matter where you go with your family, they don't know what to do for you, the people. I mean, don't get me wrong, they know you're a gangster, they know what you are. They go all out for you.
William Duran, head of the FBI's New York Criminal Division, wasn't impressed with Casso at all. He claimed that the mafioso wasn't brilliant, he was just a psychotic killer. William expressed that he was dismayed and frustrated that it had taken them so long, but promised they were going to catch him, and his prediction would soon come true.
He's really, really within a world of criminals that are bad people, that are killers, who are just treacherous, deceitful people. He stands out.
In January 1993, Casso's horrifying era came to an anticlimactic end. He was coming out of the shower at the home of his mistress in New Jersey when he found federal agents waiting for him. He was taken into custody, and it was abundantly clear that there was no way he was getting away with this. Just a year later, he pleaded guilty to 74 criminal counts, including 14 gangland killings, as well as racketeering charges. He then shockingly revealed that he wanted a plea deal, and for this, he went against everything he claimed to stand for. He actually became an FBI informant and rattled out figures like the NYPD officers who were helping him out. He told the authorities all about his violent deeds and the schemes involving the mafia, Russian gangsters, corrupt cops, and much more. He was willing to name anyone and anything, and just like that, the man who had absolutely no patience for rats had become one himself, full circle. Because of his cooperation with federal agents, he earned a spot in the witness protection program. According to multiple reports, his debriefing sessions were extremely colorful, with the former mob leader providing detailed stories about the mayhem and murder that comes with that life. He hoped that maybe one day he would see freedom once again and get a nice deal like Gambino family boss Salvatore Gravano. but he just couldn't fix his behavior. While even locked up in a special protective wing, he would get into all sorts of trouble. He tried to bribe guards, assault inmates, and smuggled whatever he wanted into the facility. And here also, he would beat up anyone talking about his illegal activities. The real deal breaker for the feds was that he was a compulsive liar and would often make things up. In 1997, the feds ripped up his deal and charged him once again.
If you want to be a gangster, be a gangster. If you want to be a government witness, come and be a government witness. You can't straddle the line, because we are going to pull the plug on the cooperation agreement if we catch you doing that. And with Casso, that's exactly what happened. It was his decision not to come on board 100%, not ours.
He was tried in court, properly this time. And 1 year later, Gaspipe was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, bribery, extortion, murder, and tax evasion. He was sent to prison for 455 years. While he was serving his time in the United States Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, he realized that he was not as healthy as he used to be. And in 2009, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The next decade of his life was plagued with various health problems, including coronary artery disease, kidney disease, hypertension, bladder disease, and lung issues from years of smoking. And on November 5th, 2020, he tested positive for COVID-19. And at this point, he was already plagued by issues with his lungs and was in a wheelchair. He requested the authorities for a compassionate release, but this was denied because the judge believed he was still a danger to the community. Just over a month later, on December 15th, 2020, Anthony Casso passed away on a ventilator. He was 78 years old. And that's it for this video. See you all in the next one.